The grocery store was as ordinary as they came, rows of fluorescent-lit aisles stocked with mundane essentials. Margot visited every Wednesday at 10 a.m., timing her trip to avoid the afternoon rush. It wasn't as though she had much else to do. At 53, her days were stitched together by small rituals: brewing a pot of tea in the morning, knitting in the afternoons, and watching reruns of British dramas in the evenings. Her life, once vibrant and bustling with the chaos of raising 2 children, had fallen into a quiet monotony since they moved out. She lived alone now, her only company a cat named Figaro who was as disinterested in her as she often felt in herself. That Wednesday felt no different as she pushed her cart through the familiar aisles. She had nearly completed her list: eggs, bread, yogurt, and a new bag of cat food, when she realized she couldn't reach the top shelf for a jar of tomato sauce. Margot hesitated, scanning the aisle for help. That's when she saw him. He was standing a few feet away, looking at a selection of pasta. He couldn't have been more than 30, tall, with dark, slightly unruly hair and an easy smile as he studied a box of linguine like it held the secrets of the universe. Margot cleared her throat, her voice tentative. "Excuse me, could you help me reach that jar?" He turned, his smile brightening. Of course. With effortless grace, he grabbed the jar and handed it to her. Their hands brushed briefly, and Margot was struck by the warmth of his touch. "Thank you," she said, a bit flustered by her reaction to such a simple gesture. "No problem," he replied, his tone friendly and casual. "I think they design these shelves just to keep us humble." Margot chuckled, surprised at how natural it felt to laugh with him. Or to remind us of our limits. As she walked away, she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest, a spark, faint but undeniable. It was absurd, she told herself, dismissing the sensation as quickly as it had come. Yet, for the first time in years, her grocery trip didn't feel entirely mundane. Margot didn't expect to see him again. The grocery store was a transient space where strangers brushed past one another without consequence. But the following Wednesday, as she lingered near the bakery section, debating whether to indulge in a scone, there he was again. This time he noticed her first. Deciding between indulgence and restraint, he asked, his voice carrying the same warmth she remembered. Caught off guard, Margot smiled. "Something like that. Restraint usually wins, but the scones look particularly good today." "Go for it," he said, grabbing a chocolate croissant from the case. "Life's too short to skip pastries." She laughed lightly, appreciating his easy confidence. "You make a compelling argument." From there, their conversation flowed effortlessly. His name was Ethan and he lived nearby, working as a freelance graphic designer. She learned that he loved cooking and often came to this store searching for ingredients to experiment with. "What about you?" he asked. Margot hesitated, feeling the faint pang of self-consciousness. Her life seemed pale in comparison to his youthful vigor. "I'm retired," she said, sidestepping the fact that her retirement had been less a choice and more a necessity. "That sounds amazing," Ethan said earnestly. "More time to do the things you love." Margot blinked, startled by his sincerity. It had been years since anyone had framed her circumstances in such a positive light. "I suppose," she said, smiling faintly. The following week, she found herself looking forward to her grocery trip, wondering if Ethan would be there. To her quiet delight, he was. Their conversations became a weekly tradition, brief but full of warmth. Ethan would share cooking tips or anecdotes from his work, while Margot found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. One day, as they walked out of the store together, he paused by her car. "I've been experimenting with pasta sauces lately. If you ever want to try one, I'd be happy to share." The offer surprised her. "That sounds lovely," she replied, though she couldn't quite imagine him showing up at her door.
"Great.
"Next week, then," he said with a grin before walking away. As Margot watched him go, a strange mix of anticipation and unease swirled in her chest. For the first time in a long while, someone had stepped into the quiet rhythm of her life, bringing with them a flicker of excitement she didn't know she'd been missing. That evening, Margot sat by her kitchen window, nursing a cup of tea as the sky turned shades of amber and gold. Her mind drifted to Ethan, his easy smile, the way he spoke with such enthusiasm about the simplest things, and how his presence seemed to ignite a forgotten part of her. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. "It's just nice to have someone to talk to," she murmured, though the words felt unconvincing even to herself. Over the weeks, their meetings continued, growing in familiarity and warmth. Ethan brought her small containers of his pasta sauces, each more flavorful than the last, and they would stand in the parking lot after their shopping, chatting until the chill of the evening nudged them apart. It was during one such evening, as she handed back an empty container, that she felt it, a pang in her chest when their fingers brushed. She withdrew her hand quickly, pretending not to notice the heat that crept up her face. Ethan, ever cheerful, didn't seem to notice, continuing to talk about his next culinary experiment. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the realization struck her like a sudden gust of wind. She had feelings for him. It wasn't a gentle awareness, but a startling, uninvited truth that left her breathless. She sat up, her heart pounding. "This is absurd," she whispered to the darkened room. Her mind raced through the implications. He was younger, much younger, and they came from different worlds. Surely, what she felt was simply the exhilaration of having someone break through her solitude. But no matter how she tried to rationalize it, the truth remained. Ethan had stirred something within her that she thought long dormant. For days, she wrestled with her emotions, replaying their conversations and interactions in her mind. There was no denying the way her heart quickened when she saw him, or how her days seemed brighter when she thought of him. But alongside the excitement was a gnawing fear, a fear of rejection, of judgment, and of what these feelings could mean for her carefully constructed world. The next time she saw Ethan, her composure wavered. When he greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, she found herself both longing to stay in his orbit and wanting to flee from the vulnerability his presence evoked. "You seem quiet today," Ethan said, concern flickering across his face as they stood near the produce section. Margot forced a smile. "Just one of those days, I suppose." His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. Instead, he told her a humorous story about a culinary mishap, his words light and inviting, drawing a genuine laugh from her despite herself. As they parted, Margot lingered in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She was falling for him, and it terrified her. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else, a hope she hadn't felt in years. The days that followed were a storm of emotions. Margot found herself caught between elation and doubt, her thoughts swinging like a pendulum. She couldn't deny how Ethan made her feel, seen, vibrant, and alive in ways she hadn't felt in decades. But with each moment of joy came the crushing weight of self-doubt and fear. She stared at herself in the mirror one morning, scrutinizing the fine lines around her eyes and the silver streaks in her hair. "What would he even see in someone like me?" she whispered. The question haunted her. Her friends wouldn't understand. They'd call her foolish or desperate. The whispers of society's judgment echoed in her mind, reminding her of the supposed boundaries she was crossing. Margot had always lived a life of quiet compliance, avoiding risks and confrontation. But now, the thought of playing it safe felt stifling. During one of their grocery store encounters, Ethan handed her a jar of homemade tomato confit. "This one's my favorite," he said, his eyes lighting up. "Try it on toast. It's simple but amazing." His enthusiasm was contagious, but Margot couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. Did he see her as just a kind neighbor? A motherly figure? Or was there something more beneath his smiles and thoughtful gestures? That evening, she sat in her kitchen with a piece of toasted sourdough, the confit spread generously on top. The flavor was exquisite, sweet, tangy, and rich. She closed her eyes and let the taste transport her, a smile tugging at her lips. But as the moment passed, she felt the familiar ache of longing. How could something so simple, a shared recipe, a passing smile, carry such weight? The following week, Ethan mentioned a cooking class he was thinking of attending. "It's this Saturday. You should come," he said, his tone casual, though his eyes were hopeful. Margot hesitated. She wanted to say yes, but the thought of stepping into his world filled her with trepidation. "I'm not much of a cook," she replied, trying to keep her tone light. "That's the point," he said with a grin. "Besides, I'd love the company." The sincerity in his voice made her heart skip a beat. Still, as much as she wanted to agree, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. "I'll think about it," she said, offering a weak smile. That night, she replayed the invitation in her mind, her chest tight with conflict. The idea of spending more time with Ethan thrilled her, but the voice of doubt was relentless. "What are you so afraid of?" she asked herself aloud. The answer came easily: rejection, ridicule, heartbreak. She had shielded herself from these things for so long, and now, the idea of stepping into the unknown felt both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in years, Margot found herself at a crossroads. She could retreat into the safety of her routine, keeping her feelings hidden and her heart guarded. Or she could take a step forward, risking everything for the chance to feel truly alive again. The days after Ethan's invitation felt like a quiet war within Margot. She wanted to say yes to the cooking class, to spend more time with him, to feel that radiant warmth of his presence. But each time she considered it, a wall of hesitation rose before her. It was during one of her sleepless nights, lying awake in her dimly lit bedroom, that an idea crept into her mind. If going to the cooking class felt too daunting, perhaps she could create a more comfortable scenario. Something simpler, something that didn't carry the weight of public scrutiny. The next morning, Margot found herself walking through the aisles of the grocery store, her cart filled with ingredients she hadn't bought in years. Fresh basil, vine-ripened tomatoes, a crusty baguette. She barely noticed when Ethan appeared beside her, his usual easy smile in place. "Stocking up for something special?" he asked, nodding toward the vibrant assortment in her cart. She hesitated, then took a breath. "Actually, I was thinking of trying a new recipe. A tomato tart. It's probably too ambitious, but—" He tilted his head, his eyes sparkling with interest. "A tomato tart sounds incredible. Do you need a taste tester?" Her heart leapt at the suggestion, though she kept her tone casual. "Well, I can't promise it'll be good, but if you're brave enough—" "I'm in," he said without hesitation. The simplicity of his response startled her. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just an earnest willingness that made her chest ache. As they parted ways, Margot clutched her grocery list with trembling hands. She had taken a step, small, perhaps, but monumental for her. The day of their dinner loomed closer, and Margot busied herself with preparations. Her small kitchen became a flurry of activity, the counters crowded with chopping boards, mixing bowls, and ingredients. She wanted everything to be perfect, not just for him, but for herself. It had been so long since she had poured her energy into something that truly mattered. When Saturday evening arrived, she set the table with care. Candles flickered softly, and the scent of fresh herbs and baked pastry filled the air. As she stood back to survey her work, a pang of self-consciousness struck her. "What am I doing?" she whispered. She glanced at her reflection in the window, smoothing a stray lock of hair and adjusting the neckline of her blouse. She wanted to look effortless, though every part of her felt anything but. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margot's pulse quickened as she opened the door to find Ethan standing there, a bottle of wine in hand and a smile that immediately set her at ease. "Smells amazing in here," he said as he stepped inside. Margot led him to the kitchen, where the tart rested on a cooling rack. "Let's hope it tastes as good as it smells," she said, her voice trembling slightly. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Ethan shared stories of his childhood, his travels, his dreams of opening his own bakery one day. Margot found herself laughing more than she had in years, the sound strange and wonderful in her ears. By the time dessert arrived, a simple bowl of berries with cream, their connection felt deeper, richer, as if the walls Margot had built around herself were slowly crumbling. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to step into the unknown. The evening unfolded like a symphony, its notes warm and full of promise. The meal had been a success, the tomato tart unexpectedly delicious, and their conversation seemed to grow in intimacy with every passing moment. Margot found herself studying Ethan as he spoke, his hands animated as he described the intricate details of baking, a craft she had never truly understood. There was something magnetic about his enthusiasm, something that made her feel more alive than she had in years. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Margot had offered him tea, but the evening felt too soft, too beautiful for anything so mundane. Instead, she found herself reaching for the bottle of wine they'd barely touched during dinner, pouring them each a glass. They settled on the couch, the air thick with a quiet tension she couldn't ignore. The conversation slowed, and they both took a sip, savoring the wine. Their eyes met over the rim of their glasses, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't sexual, not in the way she'd experienced before, but rather a subtle kind of connection. A magnetic pull that seemed to draw them closer, even as they remained physically apart. Margot, he said her name softly, almost reverently, as though tasting it on his lips. She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. He had that way about him, making her feel seen, as if everything she was, her thoughts, her experiences, had been understood and appreciated. But there was also a quiet vulnerability in his gaze, one that mirrored the uncertainty she often felt within herself. "I've really enjoyed tonight," Ethan continued, his voice a little more subdued now, as though something in the atmosphere had shifted. "I'm glad I asked you." Margot's chest tightened at the simplicity of his words, at the sincerity they carried. Her mind, ever the skeptic, wanted to question it. Why had he asked her? What did he truly want? Was this just a moment of indulgence for him, a brief distraction from his usual routine? But another part of her, the part she'd kept hidden for so long, wanted to believe in this, in him, in whatever this connection was between them. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice catching. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the way she said them, the way they resonated in her chest. The silence between them deepened. And then, almost imperceptibly, he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed lightly over hers, sending a current of warmth through her body. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin ever so slightly, the world outside their bubble vanishing into the background. Margot's first instinct was to pull away. The age gap, the difference in their lives, the vulnerability, so many reasons piled up in her mind to reject this. But she didn't pull away. She couldn't. The closeness, the intimacy of his touch, felt like something she hadn't allowed herself in years. He squeezed her hand gently, as though seeking permission. Her heart raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind, but in that moment, she felt a deep, undeniable desire to be here with him, to let whatever this was unfold. Their eyes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, as delicate as the quiet stillness between them. It was simple, almost childlike in its honesty, and yet it struck her to the core. How could she possibly answer him? How could she deny the longing that stirred in her chest, the warmth that spread from her fingertips to the rest of her body? "Yes," she whispered back, her voice shaky but certain. The world seemed to stop, the noise of her doubts and insecurities fading away as he leaned in slowly, his breath mingling with hers. Their lips met gently, tentatively, as if testing the waters, unsure of what to expect. But then, with a deep breath, they both gave into it. The kiss deepened, slow and sweet, filled with the warmth of something unexpected yet utterly right. Margot's heart beat faster, her body alive in ways she hadn't felt in decades. In the space between them, there was no age difference, no expectations, only the pure, unfiltered connection they shared. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, but above all, it was real. And for the first time in so long, Margot allowed herself to simply be, to let the moment wash over her without fear or hesitation. As the evening wore on, and Ethan left, Margot sat in the quiet of her living room, her heart a mixture of warmth and uncertainty. The soft hum of the streetlights outside seemed to echo the quiet rhythms of her thoughts. She had never imagined she would find herself in a situation like this, not at her age, not with someone so much younger. Her mind swirled, replaying their time together, the kiss, the way he had looked at her with such tenderness, such openness. She had never felt more seen, more alive, than in that moment. But beneath the joy, there was a lingering fear. A question that had been at the back of her mind for days. What will people think? Her friends, her family, the world around her. How would they react to the bond that had blossomed between her and Ethan? In a society that still clung to rigid ideas of age, love, and propriety, what place did their relationship have? Was this just a fleeting moment for him, an experiment in novelty, or something real? Margot let out a slow, shaky breath. She had spent so many years in a quiet corner of life, tending to routines and responsibilities, thinking that passion and adventure were for the younger generations. She had convinced herself that love, in its fullest, most consuming form, was no longer meant for her. She was past that age, past the fire of youthful desire. But tonight had shown her just how much she still longed for connection, for intimacy that went beyond simple companionship. She rose from the couch, pacing softly, her fingers trailing over the soft fabric of the cushions. She thought about her own mother, who had never remarried after Margot's father had passed. She had lived a life of quiet dignity, but Margot had often wondered if, in the quiet of her solitude, her mother had ever felt a desire, a need, that had been left unfulfilled. Was she wrong to have let years pass without pursuing that same kind of intimacy? Or had society's expectations on women of her age, been too strong, too loud to ignore? Margot paused by the window, her fingers on the cool glass. She looked out at the quiet night, her heart heavier than it had been before. She wasn't sure what this meant, what this connection with Ethan would become. She didn't know if it would last or if it was just an extraordinary moment in an otherwise predictable life. But what she did know was that, in the warmth of his touch, in the deep look in his eyes, she had been reminded of something she had almost forgotten, that love, real love, could happen at any age. It wasn't just the spark of youth that made love beautiful. It was the vulnerability that came with experience, the ability to see someone for who they truly were and to accept them, imperfections, pasts, and all. The truth was that love didn't care about age. It didn't care about societal rules. It only cared about connection, about the space two people could occupy together, even if that space seemed impossible or improbable to others. Margot smiled softly to herself. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know where this would go. But she was no longer afraid. She had lived so long by the rules, by the expectations placed on her. But now, for the first time in years, she felt the courage to embrace what she had, to let herself explore what was in front of her without fear of what others might say. The world outside her window was quiet, but within her, something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, Margot felt alive, not just in her body, but in her spirit. She had opened herself to a new possibility, a new chapter. Whatever came next, she knew she would face it with a heart unburdened by shame, by age, or by any doubt that love, in its many forms, could be hers. And as she settled back on the couch, she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the evening wash over her, not as a fleeting moment, but as a gift she would hold on to for as long as it was meant to last.